Hello, everyone, and welcome to the surgical services portion of the charge capture webinar. In surgical services, we have various ways that patient charges can be generated from the nursing documentation within our application. It is important to consider each type of surgical charge during the dictionary build, and you must ensure that all charges are being accurately generated throughout your testing. I will now review the different types of surgical charges. First, launch into my SIR tracker. I will find my patient on my tracker. And I'm going to launch into my intraoperative phase of care to review some of these charges. So again, based on the documentation within our different phases of care is how we will be able to generate these charges through surgery. The first type of surgical charge that we have is a time charge. To be able to generate these time-based charges, we would have to define the start time and end time, either in the toolbox parameters or within this dictionary. So when we document those corresponding fields, such as a into-room time or an out-of-room time, based off of this documentation, if the criteria for that time charge rule is met, then the system will then associate a charge based on what we have documented. A basic example of a time charge rule, or how a time charge could be dropped for a surgical procedure, is documenting the inter-room time, the out-of-room time, and the procedure severity. So both the times and severities will need to be documented within the one-time documentation to generate these charges. The times that are going to be driving these charges, as I mentioned, can either be defined in our toolbox parameters or in our surgical time charge rule dictionary. So we can see that I have documented both the severity as well as times, both inter-room times and out-of-room times. For every section or phase of care, we're going to be able to generate these charges based on our documentation, except for holding. Holding is the only phase of care that will not drop a time charge based off of those different times that were documented. The next type of surgical charge that we have is procedural-based charges. For procedural-based charges, we have flat fees, we have service fees, we have surgeon fees, and anesthetist fees. So all of these different charges are going to be dependent on the documentation of the procedure as well as the dictionary build of that procedure. On the billing tab of the procedure dictionary, we have the ability to, on an effective date range, as well as based on a surgical area, we are able to generate either service fees, which will take into account items and implants that are documented, and we also have a flat fee. The flat fee will not initially take into account any items or implants that are documented, and we will see how that will come up in our item and implant screen in just a minute. But we do still have the ability after to change whether or not, or decide as an end user whether or not we would want to charge for those items or implants when it is a flat fee procedural charge. We also have anesthetist fees and surgeon fees, which are going to be in line with what we have documented for those different performing providers. So we can see here that I've documented a total hip arthroplasty. Because I have documented this in the actual procedure field, this is the documentation that will then drive that procedural charge being dropped. The third way that we're going to be able to generate these surgical charges is through items and implants. So the documentation of items and implants within our either intraoperative or phase 1 record will allow us to generate charges. So if I scroll to my items and implants section, by documenting any of these items or pulling these items into document, we can see that I can say whether or not I want to charge for these used items or charge for these wasted items. So some of these may default to no, and that is just based on, again, how the dictionary build has been set up for the specific item. If this was a flat fee, this charge used column would default to no. However, I would be able to edit and change this to yes if I wanted to charge for some of these items. You saw me select this preference card footer button to bring in those items to document. So any of the items that I have set up in a preference card build, I will have the ability to more easily pull them in using this preference card footer button, and then I can define the quantity that was actually used and the inventory that it was coming from. So after documenting these items, as well as documenting some of these implants, again, I can use my preference card footer for ease. So once I have actually documented everything here, these different items and implants that have been documented based on the charge code that was associated in the dictionary build is what charge or what charge amount will actually drop. You heard me say charge code, and all of these different types of surgical charges that we can generate are going to be dependent on the charge code that is associated to them in their dictionary build. An additional way that we will be able to charge in the surgical services application is through the documentation of equipment. So our surgical equipment will be built in our resource and operating room dictionary, and based on a charge code that has been associated to that piece of surgical equipment, when documenting that in our intraoperative phase of care, that will generate a charge. So any of the equipment that I have within my one-time documentation that I actually select and then save, if there is a charge code that has been associated at the dictionary level, I should see a charge amount being associated when I'm reviewing these charges. In surgical services, we also have the ability to create patient charges through invasive procedures. The invasive procedure dictionary, similarly to the procedure dictionary, has an area where we can associate a charge code. This charge code is what will actually link to the charge description master and tell the system which charge amount we want to have based on what was documented. So if a Foley catheter was documented in one of the phases of care, we would see on our review of charges from the biller desktop that we are generating a charge based on that dictionary build for the invasive procedure. There are two additional ways that we will be able to generate charges through the surgical services application. One is through this additional charges body button that we can see at the top. This is going to be accessible through every phase of care, preoperative all the way to phase 2. When I launch into the screen, the first field is charge code. So these additional charges are dependent on knowing a charge code or a description for a charge code in order to generate a miscellaneous charge or a certain charge that we don't have for our equipment. Really something that would be considered miscellaneous. If there was oxygen that you may want to charge for and you had a charge code for it, this is somewhere that you'll be able to do that outside of those different phases of care, or at least within the one-time documentation. So additional charges are specific to a charge code. So if I do not know the name of that or descriptor for that charge code or the actual mnemonic, it would be difficult to pull in a applicable charge here. And again, this is accessible through every phase of care. The last way that we can generate charges through the surgical services application is by either the administration or the dispensing of these medications. So although these charges are not going to flow directly through the surgical services application, we have the ability when we document that administration to actually generate those charges from our application. So those will flow through the pharmacy application. However, the point of documentation in surgical services is how it is generated, and that is going to be through our MAR or the medication administration record up at the top here. Those are all of the 7 different ways that we will be able to generate charges through the surgical services application. After we generate these charges, at least in the testing phase, we want to consistently make sure that these charges are being generated accurately and as we desire. So someone who is auditing these charges through the biller desktop, and I will navigate to that right now. Someone who is auditing these different charges for a specific surgical case based off of a compiled effective date range will want to make sure that these are accurate charges. So we can see that I'm generating an intraoperative, well, from a preliminary standpoint, I'm generating an intraoperative time charge. I am generating supply charges. I am generating implant charges, a procedural charge, charges for equipment, and this other will represent any of the additional charges that we've entered onto this patient. So in reviewing these charges in the testing phase, I would want to ensure that all of this seems accurate. If I think for some reason that $10,000 for an implant does not seem like it is enough, if I know that one implant is $10,000 but there's an additional, this would help me then be able to go back into my intraoperative documentation to kind of spot check or confirm that the correct items or implants were documented. If I believe that a time charge rule is not being dropped appropriately, I could review the time charge, make sure that these charges are accurate. So we are just seeing these as preliminary charges right now. However, we have this review charges routine. So based on a selected case that we're seeing in our open sort, I can review specific charges. So out of all of the charges, if I expand these preliminary charges, I can see that I'm generating an intraoperative charge based off of the quantity of time and this charge code, which will generate this charge amount. We can actually see in the additional charge detail the rule as well. So this is the rule that is generating this charge. My documentation has met a certain criteria, and that criteria then associates the time charge rule that we've built in that dictionary. We can also spot check any of our supplies that have been documented. So these are the items. If I select a specific line item, I can come down and find out the mnemonic of that item or that item number, the inventory that it was documented in or pulled from, the category of that item, and the cost to our facility, as well as any charge markups that may be associated as well. Implants are going to function very similarly in reviewing the charges. I can see the implant number, the inventory it was being pulled from, the cost, and the markup percentage. So if I wanted to determine which procedures, both in invasive procedure, so it'll tell me what invasive procedure was documented, it will also show me the actual procedure. So this procedure, we're seeing that because I documented a total hip procedure, we are going to generate the service fee that has been associated in this dictionary. So if I went into my procedure dictionary and looked up the THR mnemonic for total hip arthroplasty, I would see on my billing tab that a service fee had been associated or a charge code had been placed in there on an effective date range, as well as a surgical area that this procedure was taking place in. So it met that criteria, so we are dropping the service fee charge. Because I documented this equipment in my intraoperative phase of care, we are going to drop the charge code that we can see right here. That has been associated to this resource dictionary build or the surgical equipment dictionary build. And the last charge that I can review is this additional charge. So we're not going to see any additional charge detail because we really only need this one line. This one line is exactly what we defined in that additional charges body button within our intraoperative phase of care, and this is all we're going to see. So that is how we would be able to review our charges from the biller desktop. So the biller desktop is really going to be helpful for anyone who is auditing these different cases to make sure that the charges are accurate. We have the ability to see the chart statuses, so we can see whether or not the chart is in progress, in which phase of care. So if something has been documented or activity has started in that phase of care, we can see that that was documented, and who it was documented by once it's actually completed. We'll see that in just a moment. Any cases that are in our closed sort will have been closed, and the charges will no longer be considered preliminary charges, but will be actual charges, and these will be sent from the surgical services department over to patient accounting. We can also see any canceled or deferred cases through these canceled and deferred sorts. Right now I'm viewing this through worklist mode on the biller desktop. We also have single mode where we can view by patient, we can look up by account number or by case number. Worklist mode will allow us to compile an effective, based off an effective date range. So if you just wanted to view today's cases to audit any charts or charges, you could enter T, which is today, and I just want to see anything that was documented or scheduled for today. I find my case, and I'm at the point where I'm comfortable with the preliminary charges that I'm seeing. I want to go ahead and close the case. Unfortunately, if I have not documented all of my required fields, I would not be able to close this case. If I do have all of my fields required to close the case, we would see the save button being highlighted, and all of these different phases of care would read that all fields required for closed case have been documented. So because I've met those requirements, I'm now going to be able to go ahead and close my case. So once I close this case, the charges should be sent to patient accounting in real time. And this is actually going to bring me to one of my last points. our testing for the surgical services application, it has a lot of moving parts. We need to determine that all of the different dictionary builds we have made when we are documenting certain things in the different phases of care are actually dropping accurate charges. So it's important to test all of these different scenarios and closed cases to see that this information is actually flowing from one application to another correctly, and any of the things that we're documenting on the MAR or any of those medications flow correctly to patient accounting. We also want to make sure that we are testing out reopening and closing cases. So it isn't uncommon to have something documented incorrectly or have something that needs to be edited. So if we need to go back and edit a certain item that was documented or an interim time because the time charge is not accurate, all we would have to do at this point is reopen a closed case and then edit what we need to reflect what we actually want to be charging for. So I'd like to navigate to some of the parameters that we have that will drive reopening and closing cases and how the charges will flow. So we can see here we have this on our charts body button of the customer defined parameters. We have days to reopen case as well as billing accounts receivable batch delay hours. So the days to reopen a case is pretty straightforward and exactly what this field says. After I close a case, how many days do I have to reopen that case? So as it is right now, we have 90 days to reopen a case after it has been closed. So what happens with this bar batch delay hours field is that it's actually being used to determine a window or a time frame in hours that needs to elapse once a case has been reopened after it has been closed before all of the recorded charges that we have sent as credits to billing can be reverted. If the case is closed again within that 12-hour, as we have it defined now, window, only the edits that we make to charges are going to be sent. So in testing, because we may need to, once we actually get live, we may need to reopen some cases. We may need to go back in and add some documentation that wasn't initially in there but needs to be in there to generate those charges. So we want to kind of test different scenarios. So the first scenario that we would have is we would close a case and we would reopen it and make an edit to clinical documentation that may affect some of our charges. And then we want to close that case again. And if we had our bar batch delay hours set within 12 hours, we want to close it within that 12-hour time frame and then confirm that the charges are not credited in RCG. The second scenario we want to test is reopening a different case or another case that had been closed and adding a new supply charge or adding a new implant charge. We then close the case again within those bar batch delay hours. So as it stands right now, we want to do it in less than 12 hours. And then confirm that the initial charges are not what is being credited in RCG, but instead the new charges that we have edited for that supply item or that implant, then that credit is being sent to RCG in real time. So obviously the last scenario that we want to test out is reopening a case, but letting that 12 hours that we had defined in this field elapse. For testing purposes, obviously you could set this field to a much lower number, but the idea is the same. We want to reopen a case, let that time elapse, and then confirm that the charges that originally had been credited in RCG are still the ones there. And then after closing the case again, we want to confirm that the charges are sent back. So again, we would reopen that case, let the bar batch delay hour parameter time that we've defined elapse, and then confirm that charges are credited in RCG. And after that, we would close that case again and confirm that the charges are sent back to RCG. So that is some of the testing that we want to kind of make sure is occurring based on these parameters that we have. So when it comes to testing, we want to be figuring out any scenario that could occur within surgery, whether we're doing an orthopedic case, we have an endo procedure that's taking place. We want to try and make sure that we are going to be using in our testing all of the time charge rules. We want to make sure that we have a scenario where we can drop all of those to make sure they're being reflected accurately based on our dictionary build and the criteria that we have set, as well as any of the actual procedures or invasive procedures. We want to make sure that we're only generating a flat fee or we're generating a service fee, and those items and implants are also generating a charge as well. So making sure we're going through and really thoroughly testing these different surgical types of charges is going to be monumentally helpful by the time you get live. And at this time, there is nothing else from a surgical services perspective that I would like to add. If you do have any questions about the Biller Desktop reviewing charges or generating charges through surgery, please reach out to your surgical services application specialist to follow up. Thank you, everyone.